Hey guys, welcome to week 4 in your first information for this week. We're gonna start off the first part of this week talking about graphing. I know I could give you data and give you a sheet of paper, and you'd probably do a pretty good job writing me a graph because you've had experience with that before. But what I want to do is I want you guys to do some digital graphing. Okay, being able to use Google Sheets in order to create a well-produced graph. Now, initially, it's pretty easy. It's really fine-tuning it and making it your graph and not just initially what comes up is the big thing. So let me show you the assignment first, and then we'll get into like the how-to of making a graph, okay, digitally. So basically, I have this for you. You're going to create 4 graphs that I've given you data for, right? So reminders of what independent and dependent are and where to put them on a graph. You have your data points right here, and so when you get into that, you can copy paste them or just enter them, and then basically your graph is going to go right here. And I'll kind of show you how that would look with a different graph. And then under all these, I have questions I want you to answer. So basically the independent variable, the dependent variable. And again, you know that if you built the graphs correctly. The harder of them, because I don't give you any other information, but what are some possible controlled variables that we might want to take account when studying this data? Using the graph, all of them have a question D where it's using the graph and telling me what you think may have happened. Again, there's more than one possibility. I just want you to write it out. And then again, why that could possibly happen. So again, take account into what type of graph I wanted, because sometimes you have an idea in mind and then Google will populate a certain graph and that's not the one we want. So the first one's a bar graph. Second one's a line graph. Okay. Using this data, same questions, all right, except for D and E. Then I get a scatter plot, right, which is a lot like a line graph without the line, but depending on the type of data you want, this is the better choice, especially if it doesn't like kind of continually go on in a certain direction. And then the last one that I have for you is a pie graph using pennies in their minted date, right? Answering some questions based on that. Finally, you're going to create a 5th one, and this is one where I just want you to get a data table and use social media or, just talk to your friends, but you need at least 20 data points, right? So you can do this. So make a table, create a question, create some possibilities for that question, and get at least 20 people to respond to you, and then make a graph of that. And it can be a graph of any type. It can be a line graph, it could be a bar graph, it could be a pie chart. It doesn't really matter what it is, or a scatter plot. It just kind of depends on the type of question you ask, and that question will determine how you should show me your data, right? And you've done all these before, so we should be pretty good at that. So that is pretty straightforward. What I really want you to take a look at is how do we actually create a graph. So on here, I'm going to show you quickly kind of 3 different ones with different sets of data. So this first one, you can see I have time and temperature, right? And so in order to create a graph, I'm going to go in here, I'm going to highlight all those guys. And then I'm going to come over here and, I got to open it up a little. Nope, that's not what I want. Oh, there we go. All right. So then I want that insert chart, right? And Google will automatically, maybe, is it doing it? There we go. Google will automatically populate a chart for us. I'm gonna expand this window a little bit. Oops. Maybe I shouldn't do that because then I go away. All right. And so this is really the beast that we're working with, right? And there's lots of things that I want you to take a look at. I'm going to slide me over here that I want you to be able to change. Okay. Yes, this is a good start. No, this is not what I want your graph to look like at the end. So first of all, when we're looking at this setup, right? Depending on the type of graph, you can change it. So you can have a line graph, that's the suggested, but again, it's just Google's best representation. There's a double line graph, right? Maybe that will work, maybe it won't. There's a graph that has shading under it. So there's different types of line graphs or area graphs. But then there's bar graphs, column graphs, pie graphs, scatter plots, right? Maps, and then others, kind of depending on what we're doing. For the most part, we're going to just work on the first ones because there's not a lot that we're going to do this year that is going to involve anything other than, one of those first four. Okay, so you could play with some of the buttons over here. So the x-axis they have is time. The series or the y-axis they have is temperature. So depending on what you have, you can have that there. You can play with some of these buttons, right? So the aggregate button, you can see that it takes away some of what we're looking at. Switching ahead and column, depending on how you set up the graph initially, you might need to play with that button. Row 1 is headers, right? So you can see I already had information in there, but if I take that away, it doesn't change my data, but it gives me the points that I'm working with. Use column A as labels, right? So column A, all of a sudden we touch that one, and then we get this weird like double line graph. If we really looked at it, it gives us the right information, but not really the way we want to see it, right? It is much easier to have an x-axis and a y-axis that is labeled for us, right? And again, if I had you draw a graph on a piece of paper, this is probably what I would get, right? But the thing is, we have so much more ability on here to do different things. So if we go to this customize button, which is really the one I want you to play with, and I want you to make all 5 of your graphs different. We have some, if we just go into chart style, right, you can maximize it, right, and get it really as big. I like this better because you get to see, everything over there. So you could play with some of those depending on your graph. You could smooth out. Most of the time we don't want to do that, but you could take a look at that. Chart titles and axes. So right here, right, chart title, subtitle, horizontal, and vertical axis. So depending on how you initially set it up, you can do that. This isn't a very good chart title. I would change this right away. Temperature versus time of what? Like that doesn't mean anything. So whatever this graph is showing us, so it might mean temperature over temperature increase of ice cream. Right? We want it to be more descriptive, the title, so we know what we're looking at. And that's something that I'm going to want you to do. And so you could change it there. Actually, you could just technically click on this too and change it up there. But using these guys over here is kind of nice too. So the title, if you didn't have axis titles or X and Y axis titles, you should change them, right? With what it is and a unit to be associated with it. You can change, the font, you can change the size of the font, right? So you have lots of different, you can change the color of the font, right? So you have a lot of ability to change that to make it look nice. Series, so this is our y-axis, right? We have temperature. If you don't like the blue, right, you can change it to some other color. The different types of line, the axis, the line thickness. Some of these are the ones that I like. So if I want to actually see the data labels, right, I can put those on there, those same numbers you put in, which might be nice sometimes. And then if you actually want to see exactly where they are, you can put the points in there. Okay, you can change them if you have multiple variables on a slide. And I won't give you any of that now, but in the future, we might create a multiple data set down here. But for this first one, I just want you to get the basics of creating the different types of graphs, right? So you have all that stuff that you can work with, data labels and trend lines, right? If we want a trend line and we want to know how we were compared to that line, you can fit all that stuff in. Right now, we probably don't need that. The legend, right? So playing with the series, but now we can play with the legend. So the position of it, like right now, do we see it? But maybe we want it on the right, and we can see, those stars all mean temperature and stuff like that. Especially if we have multiple sets of data, that's something nice to play with. And again, you can change the size and the font and the texture and all that good stuff of that. Horizontal axis, right? So that time down below, again, you can take a look at that. Treat labels as text, right? So just kind of playing with some of this stuff. That goes into specifically those numbers that we have up there. If they're nice and orderly, great. If not, it's probably better just to have them labeled as we want to see them. You can also do minimum. So if we don't need to go all the way down to 0, right, just playing with the number like this, like what if I just wrote a 6 in there? All of a sudden, you can see we start at 6 and we go to 10. If we want to see it a little bit differently, like maybe we come out to 15, right? So we don't have any data out here, but maybe it helps us see like maybe where the possible trend would be if we were going to get to 15, if we tossed in a trend line, right? That might help us out a little bit. So you can play with all that stuff. It's going to give you what it thinks it should right away based on your data, but you can see like this point right here, all of a sudden, if it's at 10, we don't see it. Can you play with that? Okay. Logarithm scale, we don't need to say. Same thing on the vertical axis, right? You can work with data labels and mins and maxes. So down here, if we want to increase it, right, if we want to see some angle, it doesn't go all the way down to 0. So maybe we change it up. Maybe we say the minimum value is 10, right? And then we come down here and, oops. What if I do 20? Does that change it better? There we go, right? And it drops away down. So you can play with all these things to make it yours, to make it the best it can possibly be. And then the other one, one of the main ones we can use are these grid lines, right? So whether we wanted to do it by counting, right, or by step. So by step, if I change this, right, and I go, by 5s, it's going to create 5 different lines, right? If I just count the lines. If I do by step, right, and I go by 5s, you can see, okay, by step, it's going to give me all these lines up to every one equals a 5, okay? So you can either do count or step. It just kind of depends on the type of data you want. Same thing down here, count or step with the minor axis. So you could do step and you could do 2, right? And then basically every one of these small lines, and they're hard to see here, basically every one of those small lines is an increment of 2, all right? And maybe that's too much. Maybe we want to go 5, right? So every one of these lines is another step of 5. So either you can count the numbers in between or you can write exactly what you want. And then you can change the colors of them so you can see them a little bit better. If we go to minor grid lines and we want to make them purple, you could see them a little bit better. I would also do the major grid lines because it looks like there's nothing there. But all these things you can customize, and that's really what I want you working on. Make sure we're labeled, right? Make sure that we have a good label up here. Make sure that we have good Y and X axis labels, right, to create all these different charts. So let's say, all right, that one's good. Now what we can do is we can take this guy and we can copy chart, okay? And then we can go to our activity. If we right click in the box and we paste it in there, and we say, yeah, link to spreadsheet, because if you do that, then if you change it, it'll change here until I see it. And it comes in and I get to see what you made, right? And so that's a nice little piece. Now I'm gonna get rid of this so you can't see it. That's not even the right data, but let's get rid of it. So that's making a graph, right, of that guy. Let's see, I'm gonna delete that guy. We don't need him anymore. Let's go down to here. So what do you think, what type of graph will we get when we put this together? All right, so now we have 2 sets of data, and we come down and we go into insert chart. All right, so we get this bar graph, right? Maybe let's change that. See if we can make a little bit more sense. So we have boy and girl. Boy and girl what? We have book. We have no label down here. We want to be able to change all that, okay? So maybe it's just in the type, right? The type of bar graph we have. Maybe instead of stacked, we could have a line graph. Does that tell us what we want to see? Does that make sense for this type of information? Or we can go into, a standard bar graph. Does that make more sense? Okay. We could do a pie chart. Okay. Are we getting what we want right here? It really depends on the questions, right? It really depends on the questions. Do you see the difference between boys and girls right here? Or do you just see the difference in books? Depending on the question, maybe that matters, maybe it doesn't. What if we did a scatter plot? Okay. Kind of all over the board. What are we looking at right here? So on this assignment, I'm telling you specifically what I want you to do, except for the last one. But when you gather your data for the last experiment or the last set of data collection that you're going to get, that's where you want to play with it. And what am I trying to tell the people based on the type of plot I got. So on this one, I'm just going to go back to a standard bar graph, which is not, or a column graph in this case, which is not what it originally gave us, but that's okay. And then I can go, and I'm not going to go through it all again, but I can go and I can change all of this stuff, right? So book, like, is that really good? Like, what are we talking about? Maybe book genre. Here, what does this mean? These are just a bunch of numbers. You know, we should have a y-axis right here. So it's all those little things that I want you to look at, and you can use this customize to change all of that. Okay, so there's one more look. Let's look at our last set of data and just see what it comes up with. Okay, what do you think? Looking at that data, ice cream sales and temperature. If I do that and I go up here, what is it going to give me? All right, it gives me a scatter plot right away. All right, is that pretty good for what we're working with? Can you see a trend line? Would a line graph actually work here, or is this a better set of data? Even though we could kind of connect the dots, does connecting the dots make sense if we're comparing sales to temperature? We're not increasing the temperature constantly, right? It's just an indicator of what's going on, right? You know, so we can change that. What if we did a line graph? See how that doesn't make a whole heck of a lot of sense? Based on what we have there. What if we have a bar graph? Does that make sense? Some of you might be saying, yeah, but then take a look at, like, if people didn't look at this information down here, is that in order? Is that what you want? Is that what you intended, right? And that's what I'm looking at when you go and you try this out and you gather somebody else's information, okay? Is trying to do that. So all in all, you have 4, again, that you are going to create for me. Create them on a Google Sheet. Send your information right there. Link them so you have all that information. Once you have that chart, then you can answer these questions, right, to the best of your ability. A line graph, a scatter plot, and a pie graph. And then, again, customize your own. So that is the information I want you to think about and use, but also it is the homework that you have for this first day. All right, so good luck. Again, come on if you have questions. Talk to you later.